can I now turn to your very own lecturer, specialist, Dr. Mariam Kamunyu, who is just outside of the main hall, but she's been here from the outset. She is kindly agreed to speak and was behind the organization of this event, so many thanks to her, and obviously Lady Dean. And when I initially formulated the program, as a man, I really omitted, as we often do, the stories of women. So almost immediately, Marian and Faith said, no, this is not the whole story. I'm not quite as awful as that, but certainly I realized that I really had not made sufficient provision for that story to be told. And like most men will admit, if it wasn't for women in the struggle would never have got anywhere. So I humbly apologize for that, my omission. And can I turn over to you, Dr. Kamunyu, for that correction? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judge Peter. Thank you for that introduction and for that admission. Maybe you suspected that I would out you, so you said it yourself. So, as he says, my name is Dr. Mariam Kamunyu. I am a human rights lawyer and a gender equality specialist and enthusiast. So like he said, one of my occupational hazards really is that when I listen to anything, I listen out for women's voices and experiences and perspectives. And so when Peter and I sat to speak about this project, and you're speaking about historical injustices, I just remember hearing very much the absence of the women's experience. And so my role here today is really simple, and it's simply to invite all of us to just honor and recall and examine women's participation in the struggle for Kenya's independence. Now, when Judge Peter initially invited me, I wrote a small paper, only to realize that the good judge was literally availing me just 5 minutes of fame, which I'm now squandering with shabby jokes. So that said, I just want to share with you 3 thoughts today. And the first is that I want to expose the exclusion, the erasure, the invisibilization of women in the narration of the Mau Mau liberation struggle. And secondly, I want to state here very briefly just a few instances of the participation and the persecution of women in the struggle. And third, I just want to leave you with a small reflection and a challenge. So on to that first idea on the exclusion of women. You know, they say that until the lion learns how to write, every story will always glorify the hunter. And in the case of the Mau Mau in particular, we can agree that the mainstream and popular history has been a record of the conqueror and not the conquered. Now, if we can agree on this narrative, and I'm sure many of you have since questioned your history classes, those of us who grew up in Kenya and went through the 844 system, now that we are older and we've had an opportunity to interact in this discourse, now realize that our history classes were a bit distorted and we've gotten a better sense of the real Mau Mau narrative. And what we see is that there's an even deeper erasure. Aside from the erasure of the story of the conquered, there's an even deeper erasure and invisibility in the case of the role of women. Almost completely obscured from sight in the general narrative is the woman's story. While I do recognize that a lot of great work has been done, and I say this because as a researcher, I wouldn't even be able to make these conclusions, to tell you what was women's role, if other people had not gone ahead and done this work. So I do recognize that work has been done. But nevertheless, like the good judge said, the male voices and perspectives narrating the Mau Mau ordeal far outnumber the female ones a great deal. The second thing, as I said, that I wanted to highlight today was just the participation and the persecution of women. With regards to the participation of women, there is the obvious, which is the domestic role. And this is very well known. The things that women did, they had to carry on with the domestic roles as the Mau Mau struggle went on, as they were doing other things for the liberation. And then the domestic role of women is really uncontested. So I will not focus here in my remarks. What I do want to focus on is the less spoken about role. So for instance, the roles of women as combatants, for instance. You've had from Faith, you've had from Dedan Kimati's daughter as well, that women were part of combatants. For instance, we have even a woman that was at the level of Field Marshal. We have Field Marshal Modoni Kerema. You have, for instance, Modoni Madenge, General Matenge's wife, and you had many other women that were in combat. So, and that is something that is frequently not acknowledged. And then secondly, they acted as key, and this is really key from a combat perspective, and when you think of even of armed conflict in this day, they acted as key external, internal conduits and scouts. So for instance, they were central in the transmission of food, in the transmission of ammunition, intelligence, medical supplies and clothing. They were all collected and disbursed to the forest fighters. And I must say, at great personal risk to themselves, since they had to then go back to the villages where they could be outed and prosecuted for this. They also facilitated what were called posters after the word post office, which were pre-arranged sites, which were used, they were the preferred distribution method of choice by the Mau Mau warriors. And so in some instances, for instance, I read very interesting research where women would, for instance, wrap bullets around the thighs of their infants and then tie these infants onto their backs and make a delivery to the forest edge. So as I'm saying, very risky, but the role they did play in this regard, as we can see, is clearly indispensable because the Mau Mau fighters did not have access to the outside, and yet they needed to survive in the forest. And so it's clear they were surviving in the forest because of the role that was being played by women. And secondly, I want to focus on the persecution of women, and this is where I will focus larger, because this is really one of the areas where there has been a great erasure. And, you know, Ken Walibora put it best in an article that I saw when he described the female condition in Mau Mau as double incarceration. And, you know, women often find themselves in a double bind, whereby the general population is in a situation of strife, and is in a situation where they're being brutalized and there are various challenges. But because of the female condition, you experience a disproportionate burden in this account, and I will demonstrate. One of the ways that women really were persecuted is through forced communal labor. So women were forced to endure, for instance, unending back-breaking terracing projects. So the colonial government, for some reason, were always building terraces, and women were the ones that were forced to perform this labor. And now this had two effects. So in addition to being forced communal labor, which in modern day or in other contexts could be called slavery, this meant that they remember they're the ones that also have the primary caregiver and now breadwinning roles now that the men are gone. And so they do not even have time to then work on their own farms to find provision for themselves. And so this really did act as a double-edged sword. The second thing is that women were also persecuted through detention, you know, and I'm sure you've had colonial Kenya, particularly during the emergency period, referred to as Britain's Gulag, because nowhere else in the British Empire was confinement ever used as extensively as it was used in colonial Kenya. So for instance, as at the end of 1954, the daily average of Mau Mau detainees held in the colony reached a peak figure of almost 72,000 detainees. And then records show that at least 8,000 of these were women, and they were interned in a variety of prisons, detention camps, work camps, district camps, and more than 98% of these also were Kikuyus from the Central Highlands, as records show. The detention itself it wasn't just mere confinement, but it was characterized by very harsh living conditions, by brutality, by humiliation and constant violence, both physical and sexual violence. Women were raped, and interestingly, men were also raped in this detention camp. So that was one of the ways. Another ways that they were persecuted was through forcible repatriation of women and their children. So for instance, following the famous Operation Anvil, during that emergency, there was this Operation Anvil that was held in Nairobi, which led to the detention of thousands of Africans, mostly Kikuyus and their allies, and those who were deemed to be Mau Mau allies or sympathizers. And following this operation, thousands of women and children were forcibly repatriated from Nairobi to the reserves in what we would today call forced displacement or internal displacement, which is an egregious international crime. And because they were also being targeted, like in that operation Andrew, because they were also being targeted on the basis of their tribe, this could also amount to modern day ethnic cleansing, which aims to change the demographic composition of a certain territory, of a certain region. So again, if we also look at these atrocities through this modern day lens, and these modern day definitions that we have since come up with from an international criminal law perspective, we can be able to see that this was indeed a great persecution of women. Women also endured extreme torture and sexual violence. So the violence was in various forms. So for instance, during hours of forced labor, various interviewees say that they were whipped for instance, showing fatigue or working too slow. You can imagine that you're being whipped for looking tired when you are in fact very tired. They endured public beatings and humiliations. These women were stripped naked. There are instances where they would do very humiliating things to them. So, for instance, force them to run around with buckets of excrement on their heads while they're naked. Sexual assault was common, with rifle butts and bottles inserted into their private parts, breasts squeezed with pliers. Rapes were frequent, and these rapes were often in public. I read several terrible reports of rapes of mothers and daughters together, just out there in the open. These were really like public and almost like it was official policy. There was also confinement in ndakis. So ndakis were like makeshift cells, although calling it a grave would be more apt. They were like 4 feet deep holes, halfway filled with water and covered in sisal and branches, and they were infested with snakes and vermin. And so for whatever infraction, or for no reason at all, these home guards and this colonial government authorities would throw the women in these villages, or would be thrown in those ndakis for a few hours as punishment. And really, this is beyond cruel and inhuman treatment. So women and their dependents, particularly in those villages that were deemed to be allied to Mau Mau, lived in constant fear, not knowing when they would be singled out for the most minor infraction or for no reason at all, even like I said. And then one of the final acts of persecution that I want to focus on is the extermination of women. Something I do believe that there was a direct effort in the extermination of women. The targeting, the torture, the massacre, and the sexual assaults of women by the British is well established. There are particularly very many reports with regards to this targeting for Kikuyu women in particular. And I'm just giving the example of Kikuyu women just because there's a lot of research in this area, but acknowledging, as was said by Faith before and by Evelyn, that the struggle was indeed nationwide. And particularly for those women that were known relations or associates of Mau Mau fighters, they were particularly targeted. And so was there an official or unofficial colonial policy for the extermination of the Kikuyu, for instance? If assuming there was one, if we were to assume there was one, and given time, I would have prosecuted this more thoroughly, because I do believe there was one. What would be the most efficient way to exterminate a community aside from detaining and killing its men? Surely an efficient way, if you were trying to do so, to exterminate a community, would be to target the woman and the child. And when I speak of extermination, ladies and gentlemen, it can happen in far more creative ways than death by bullet. So death by bullet is one of them. But it can include death by a combination of forced labor, of beatings, malnutrition, famine, starvation, and disease, and life in punitive barbed wire villages that you cannot get away from. So this was the reality for these women that were living in this emergency villages, as they were referred to. So this was a form of extermination, and was still at the time when reports were made to the colonial government, they denied this status. They said, no. It's just that in those villages, these women have refused education, so they're not clear on the right ways to feed their children. They did know how to feed their children, so yes, there was clear loss of life. There was clear, massive loss of life owing to these factors that I'm describing, for instance, from starvation only. And so it is clear, because there was loss of life and there are these factors and there's no help coming, they did want the villagers in the emergency villages to suffer and to die. So, as you can tell from the foregoing, women, particularly those affiliated with the Mau Mau, because when you see those that lived in loyalist camps didn't suffer quite the same fate. So the women were completely dehumanized, and they were the biggest, most open and abused target of the conqueror and the colonizer. They really were a soft target just because they were available. And now, I describe these horrors against women to you, not to undermine any other role that was played, for instance, by the Mau Mau fighters. That can never be undermined, and it is indeed well recognized. But I describe these horrors just because the experiences of women are not as well known or as well narrated. And so, like I began by saying, the woman's role is thoroughly invisibilized. And yet I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, and without fear or favor indeed, that our liberation struggle would not have been possible at all without the participation and this hectic persecution of women that I'm describing to you. And so just as a final word, I think the rallying call is for me and really for us too. I would be very happy and I really thank the good judge for already making this happen and for being so open when I said that I think we should have this discussion. The final rallying call really is that in discussing historical injustices, in any initiatives that we endeavor or to begin or to continue with regards to historical injustice, particularly with regards to this Mau Mau struggle, we must not be part of a fresh injustice by leaving out the experiences and the perspectives of women. If we do that, then this is a fresh injustice in not recognizing this sacrifice. And we must see women holistically. We must see their strength, their resilience, and their sacrifice that I have spoken about. So in all our discussions, like I said, all projects on historical injustice, we must consistently pursue what I like to call her story, because his story, and then his HIS story is very clear. But her story, like I've said, has suffered a lot of erasure. So even as we decolonize our minds of these fallacious narratives, of what happened with the struggle, we must simultaneously and always examine and recall women's participation and honor their sacrifice through acts of truth-telling and justice-seeking. And I thank you very, very much for your attention. Thank you.